How's it going, everybody? My name is 𝙁𝙤𝙪𝙄𝙀𝙗, and I'm with Dr. Kevin Brunacini and Dr. Joe Klemczewski, and we are the Flexible Dieting Podcast. And today we're going to talk about inflammation. I don't know about you guys. For me, I've heard the term inflammation throughout my 16 years in this coaching industry, and it just it seemed like the term had faded for a little while, but I feel like it's kind of back on the return of everyone's talking about inflammation. And I think that a lot of people maybe don't fully understand what inflammation means, or they maybe just misuse the term, whether it's in the gym or even if I'm buying groceries and running into somebody. It's just someone's always talking about, oh God, I just feel really inflamed today. You know, I just need to be doing X, Y, and Z. I feel so inflamed. And so I wanted to just, do this discussion, do this podcast, and maybe trying to clear up what inflammation really is, go into a brief background. So, and I'm going to ask you guys this, but I'll just kind of run with it real quick. When we're talking about inflammation, at least in like a clinical setting, there's more than one type, right? We have like acute inflammation. So something that's maybe sudden, very rapid. We have chronic. That's something that's maybe happening over time. And, to kind of give some examples, right? If someone falls down, they break their leg, you might be, there's going to be some inflammation there. That's something that's just sudden and happened. Your body is trying to help heal that trauma that maybe is to that leg or whatever. And then you have something like chronic that's, again, developing over time. So one of these things, and I know, Joe, you've done a lot of in-depth information about this, is like, I'm going to just talk about atherosclerosis real quick. Something where due to not the best diet choices, we can start to develop plaque into the arteries. And that's something that can happen over a long period of time. It doesn't just mean like we just wake up after a weekend of binge drinking and it's like, man, I'm just so inflamed with atherosclerosis today, and I just need to go eat some fruit to just, detox myself. So, and we'll get into all of that here in a little bit. But so I kind of wanted to give some quick background on that, because again, it just seems like there's so much information. There's so many different individuals now that are also claiming that they can, fix all of these inflammatory markers, and they might be able to help to some extent, but I still think that there's a lot of misinformation out there. So Joe, because you've done some recent information on this, I'm going to throw it to you. How do you discuss inflammation to somebody? Let's say more of this fitness background, let's say. So anyone that's trying to build muscle or lose weight or whatever, how would you explain inflammation to them?
So first, I generally don't, because I agree with you. It's such an ambiguous, misunderstood term. It's kind of weird to me because inflammation can be so many things. So because of what you're describing, it being such a confluence of misinformation and misunderstanding in the industry at large, I did a 5-part series in our Flexible Dieting Institute research review. I wrote, I think, a 15 or 25-page ebook on it that's available through our site. And what I learned, because I had to sort some of these things out, like maybe I'm missing something. And what I realized as I'm trying to get this information distilled down for lay people to understand it in the most practical way is inflammation is anything that your body just doesn't feel as normal homeostasis. And so if your body has to fight against anything, like you said, you sprain your ankle or break your leg, if you have COVID, if you get a bee sting, like your body has an acute, and this is the important part, immune system reaction. Because then we can get into the acute immune system reaction, a chronic long-term, or autoimmune. So inflammation truly isn't necessarily how you feel. It's a literal process happening in your body. My son cut his hand in 3 different places with, on a broken glass, puncture wounds and so forth. So you have a laceration here, a puncture wound here. It's like the immune system immediately goes there with white blood cell, differentiated processes to fight infection potential, to clean things up, to start the healing process. And that's inflammation. So where the dietary aspect comes in is the fact that we can eat foods that are pro-inflammatory. They actually cause inflammation in all kinds of systems in our body that you may feel. You can also eat anti-inflammatory foods that reduce inflammation or support that process. You can have behavioral parts of your life, how much you sleep, how you train, overtraining or not, that can be pro or anti-inflammatory. So there's just a lot of things, that you really need to think about before throwing that term.
Yeah. And just, adding to that, to your point, if we work out incredibly hard, right, and we're sore, that's inflammation. You know what I mean? Like there is inflammation right there. You tore down, you broke down some muscle tissue. Now you have some inflammation within that muscle. So, the big thing for people listening is like, what are you trying to say? Like, so, oh, I feel like I'm inflamed or I'm in an inflammatory state. What are you trying to say? You're like, really? Is it something that you read on the internet and you're like, oh, I have a symptom like that? Like, what are you trying to say? So to Kevin, again, how do you explain to people, like, let's go kind of with what Joe was saying, like when they're eating, foods throughout the day, do you kind of give them, hey, maybe watch out for these foods and these foods, maybe not necessarily because it's inflammatory, but in a sense, maybe along those lines as well? Like, do you kind of explain anything along those lines with your clients?
Historically, not necessarily. Um, when I look at this is I'm speaking generalities and making assumptions of past clients that I could see falling into maybe the bandwagon of you know falling into the bandwagon of terminology of anti-inflammatory and just inflammation itself, and going in just the whole rabbit hole of BS. Or I'll just leave it at that. But generally what I have seen is that there's other issues that's going to be more of a heavy hitter than just the nutrition when it comes to what's probably pro-inflammatory. So their sleep, as you mentioned, Joe, is way off, which frankly is more likely than anything else, honestly. It's they don't sleep, they're completely stressed out because of work obligations, family obligations, all obligations. Therefore, they're just chaotic, they're hypervigilant every day, constantly. And what do you expect? You're going to be tired. Not say that it's inflammatory, but it's not helping, especially if your nutrition is not necessarily the greatest in the terms of food quality or calorically. It's just over, not to mention if you are overweight, that's already setting you up, priming the system, if you will, to be in that state to begin with. So add all those variables together, then you have potential issues. Um, I, without repeating anything, especially what Joe said, it's all contextual, of course. My point I was going to make, fortunately you did mention, Austin, was about the contextual use of inflammation, because exercise is just that. Thus, does that mean exercise is terrible? Of course not. It's all contextual based on how we describe and what the definition of its use is. So, therefore, I'm quite maybe lenient on expressing anti-inflammatory terminology or foods to connect with that term, just so I don't get the idea of like good or bad or dichotomous understandings of how food is perceived. Because if they see it as this being pro-inflammatory, then of course sugar is going to be the scapegoat and therefore bad, when it can be the case. But look at everything else. You have to factor that in and just consider moderation and the dose. And of course, that's where it gets into complications, because that's different for everyone. But I'll stop there. But I say yes, but more so no, just because it's just depends on the individual itself.
No, I loved how you kind of ended that, because you brought up exactly what I wanted to transition to next, in regards to the food, right? Talking about the pro and anti-inflammatory foods, talking about also having a sense of balance, because we're the flexible dieting podcast, right? We all are big fans and enjoy flexible dieting. So really what I think people are saying when they feel inflamed or they're worried about all the inflammation that they have within their diet, I think they're just referring to their diet in general, right? We know saturated fats, those are, there's really very little, there's no benefit, right? If we eat a lot of high saturated fats, we're going to have a lot of links to a lot of different risk factors. Sugar, right? If we have a lot of like non-fruit vegetable type of sugars that have low fiber, those can create inflammatory things. So earlier I talked about atherosclerosis. One thing that we know is that's a buildup, right? We get plaque within our arteries. We get a lot of fat and cholesterol that can get built up. And as Joe had mentioned, when that happens, when we get plaque buildup in our arteries over time, like we have white blood cells that love to go and basically kind of impact those, and we develop plaque from those. And so, I think that's kind of, obviously not that far in depth, but I think that's what people are saying. Like they're worried about that. And they should be. We should all be worried about that. But we can control that, right? We can control that by making sure we are eating more anti-inflammatory foods. But I also think it is okay to have the sense of balance. And this is where I'm going back to the flexible dieting podcast of, of still enjoying foods that maybe aren't that nutrient dense, that aren't as quote healthy for us. But as long as we're still checking the boxes, I know we've kind of talked about that in the past. So throwing it back to you, Joe, how do you walk that line with people? Again, we're not telling them about inflammation, but how can we continue to better educate our clients on, we want you to be, eating fruits, vegetables, very nutrient dense foods, but it's okay to have that enjoyment. And if this person is worried about, plaque buildup and things like that, how do you kind of explain that from a flexible dieting standpoint?
Well, it is a process because most people are coming to us because they want some pretty solid, rapid health change. They want to lose body fat. They want to feel better. Maybe there is a true medical known quantity that they're trying to address. And if we go down this road right away, other than process, because process first is how are we going to get there? Let's start improving your health right now. When we start getting to that educational component, then it's, hey, these foods, high processed sugar foods, trans fats, and so forth, they are pro-inflammatory. They make your body release these cytokines, which are toxic to your body, even neurotoxic, creates inflammation in your cerebral vascular arteries. And like, that's how we get disease states. 75% of people die early because of these preventable behavior-related health habits. And so every time you eat fruits or vegetables or something that are anti-inflammatory, that's money in the bank for you to be aging less. And even the status of our body, fat, adipose tissue, body fat cells, as a collective system, that is an organ. And the more body fat you carry, the more of those cytokines and chemokines, which are the things that for chronic and autoimmune inflammation type processes, like that's what kills you slowly. And that's why you may die 20 years sooner. It's why you may get cancer when you wouldn't have otherwise because you were healthier, or heart disease, or Parkinson's, or Alzheimer's. So true inflammation is aging, and it is the foundation of your health. So everything you can do, from getting better sleep to, as you guys said, less anxiety, even, like that's just important. So yes, have that slice of pizza once in a while. Yes, learn where you have the boundaries for some fun indulgence, but the cornerstone of your health habit building has to be anti-inflammatory. Whether you call it that or not, that's what you're after.
I'm going to throw the same thing over to you, Kevin, with your clients. How do you kind of explain that balance from from us knowing that we're recommending they're eating very nutrient healthy foods, but also allowing them to have those indulgences, but still sticking on the track of them meeting their goals, and for us making sure that they're still staying healthy as well. Because I feel like as coaches, we are trying to get our clients to meet their goal. Like Joe said, maybe it's weight loss, but I can maybe speak for the three of us on this podcast that behind the back of our minds, we also want to make sure that they're still taking care of what's going on inside. We want them to lose weight, but we also want to make sure that they're eating foods that are going to help add longevity to their life. So any suggestions that you give to your clients within those topics, Kevin?
I think it goes without saying, maintenance, sustainability, whatever you want to call it, is always the undertone for each of us. But certainly for me, that is always my undertone when I communicate with clients. I don't care how fast you lose the weight, but tell me in 5 years, show me how in 10 years that you can keep it off in a healthy manner. Then good. Then I'll say that I was successful with that client. But I feel like I need to regress my first answer for response, because what you had said, Joe, with more or less getting someone started and then building up those scaffold of skills in terms of food quality and improving that over time. That's how I tend to approach clients. We need to first make sure we're in the landing zone in terms of the goal process, and then we'll little by little tweak food quality as it fits, or whatever the context may be. Because if there are cardiovascular issues genetically or already primary, then I would say, honestly, we're going to focus on to begin with, but nevertheless, for the sake of this, we're going to now shift foods that are going to be heart healthy, if you will, or to reduce any type of additional risk, because it is very powerful in that regard. I'm not going to necessarily call it anti-inflammatory just because for me, it's just a trigger term, but nevertheless, it's still doing that in essence. I'm just saying we're just reducing saturated fat and being, I guess, more technical in that, right? But in a nutshell, it's still doing the same thing of, reducing foods that are not going to be pro-inflammatory. So that's how I go about it. It's very similar to Joe's, where it's a matter of scaffolding little by little, because that process probably never does stop for any one of us. It's always going to be an evolving thing. Things change medically speaking. Therefore, we have to adapt to whatever those new rules may be, especially nutritionally. So, but I think goes without saying, when it does come to inflammation or whatever term we want to call it, and I noticed even with you, Austin, to talk about trans fat, we're not very dogmatic. Yet it was still hard for us to say, oh, trans fats are just bad, we need to avoid those at all costs. Yet it's still hard for us to say that because it's just dogmatic. But there are very few nutrition things where we know these are just not good at any level. Trans fats being one, saturated fat being a second to all those. Some is okay, but still it's best to just avoid or limit as much as possible. Sugar adds to that with but there's a lot of caveats to that. But otherwise nutrition is pretty maybe go flexible, as our podcast implies. So understanding the boundaries, the rules, the language, and adapt and learn from it. I'll just continue going on the diatribe here, but that's how I go about it, is teach as I go and continue to improve and refine as I become more skilled.
I love it. So we've provided some examples of inflammation, the differences, some things that you can do, the listener, to try to, keep yourself in a healthy state. And for more information, for more in-depth stuff, check out Joe's 5-part series. Check out the ebook on the Diet Doc store, and we will see you guys in the next Flexible Dieting Podcast episode. Thank you, guys.